Hi, friends. If you're listening to this, this is Daniel, your usual host. I'm here with Hugh Zhang and Andrei Korenkov, two of our Gradient founders. And we are gathered together because we have a couple of updates for you about the Gradient that we wanted to convey. In summary, a couple of things are going to be changing. And we wanted to take the opportunity just to talk a little bit about how we all got involved in the Gradient, what this whole thing is, because a lot of you have joined us recently, and then talk about what's going to be next for us. So maybe, Andre, if you want to get started, you and Hugh are probably the best people to talk about the history of the Gradient. So if you want to tell us a little bit about that, maybe we can get started there.
That's right. Yeah. I guess I can throw in some things. In a way, I'm part of your history, partially as a person who created a podcast. So maybe some listeners from long ago remember me from that. But yeah, me and Hugh have been around basically since the inception of a Gradient. Hugh slightly before me. And that was 2018. So it's been over 6 years, since it started. As any listeners or readers of a Gradient might have noticed, it's been a bit of a slower phase for the article side of the Gradient. We really have not published that much the past year or so, and that has to do with a lot of factors. Partially, all of us graduated from grad school and are now working full-time jobs, which makes things a little bit challenging. So the announcements will have to do with that. I guess we can get into the background and stuff a little later in detail, but that's the preview. And maybe, Hugh, you can frame how the Gradient got going in the first place.
Sounds good. I mean, the Gradient was started by 6 people at Stanford who were just, at the time in 2018, Andrei Karpathy had been blogging, and blogging had been really starting to take off in ML. And we were like, wow, it would be really nice if we could just create a collection of the highest quality posts and sort of give publicity to people who had really good things to say, but maybe didn't have network or Twitter following at the time. To just have their own reach. We would just collect everybody's posts and then sort of edit them and share them with the community. And that was just the idea. And we just kicked it off from there. We were very lucky to get a bunch of really, really cool articles at the very beginning. And then just sort of things just went from there. And over the years, it's sort of evolved a ton. We also started the newsletter and then the podcast. But over the last 6 years, it's been phenomenal just working with everybody and just helping share people's machine learning posts with the world.
Yeah. So if you've been following us along any of our avenues, the newsletter, the podcast, the articles, we all really want to thank you for doing that. This has been a very meaningful part of all our lives, I think, in many different ways. And so it's great to see that people just get something out of this. I think that really for all of us, this is kind of about making something that people can learn from, that means something to people. And so we want to talk a little bit about the changes that are kind of happening to the Gradient. And this is primarily on the side of articles. As Andre mentioned, things have been slowing down. And that is in part because we are all having busy lives. I'll make a slight amendment. We didn't all graduate grad school, actually. We all have slightly different relationships to grad school. Maybe we can elaborate on this later. Hugh is laughing really hard right now because he has a very interesting story, which he may want to relate later. I won't force you to do that now, Hugh. But the way we're going with this right now is for every article you see on the Gradient, this requires quite a bit of effort from either one, maybe 2 or 3 editors. We have a pretty high bar for the stuff we put out on our site. And so this often takes the form of going through drafts and quite a few back and forths between an editor and the person who wants to write the article. And up till this point, we've been accepting pitches for unwritten articles. So you can pitch us with just an idea for an article, maybe a couple of thoughts. And we really try to work with you to flesh that out into something that can go up on the site. This takes a lot of work. And at this point in time, we are pretty low on editors. We are also not an organization that really has any serious form of funding. And so it's a little bit hard for us to put the time we want into this kind of thing. So what we decided to do at the moment is we're gonna go for a period of kind of limited activity right now. And what that means is we won't be accepting pitches for unwritten articles anymore, but we will consider posting full-length finished drafts if you have things that you want to submit to us. If you have something on your own blog, we would love to amplify it if it seems like it's a good fit. Really, the way all of us have been seeing this is we considered fully sunsetting the magazine, but we really think that the Gradient still can be this place where, as Andre said, if you're somebody without a big Twitter following of your own and a lot of people who read your blog, we want to be able to amplify your work to the ML community. And so this is the best way we think we know how to do that.
Right, exactly. And I guess just aside from editing, the other problem, and this is going out to anyone who submitted a pitch, we probably haven't gotten back to you since you did that, or we might have gotten back to you and then never followed up. So unfortunately, that is another factor, is just having people who are kind of responsible for all the communications, all the back and forths has been challenging. I tried to do that for a little while and didn't do a very good job. So we made the call that it probably makes more sense to limit the activity, to accept fewer pitches, but pitches with more finished drafts. And part of the reason why it's not just that we don't have kind of a capacity to do this with that much kind of consistency, it's also because things have changed to some extent since 2018. There's been much more avenues for people to do their own writing on things like Substack. Things have grown. It used to be people had their personal blogs, and they did post their own articles, but it was somewhat niche and not that common. I think it has become more common, and many people have started their Substacks and started putting out really nice pieces. So the Gradient as a sort of centralized place to publish makes a little bit less sense, especially if we don't provide that editing service. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is the newsletter will continue as before, pretty much in the same format, but we will be adding a new section that we are going to call something like Best from the Community or Highlights from the Community, where you can also pitch us or just tell us of things you have published on your own blog, on your own website, and your own Substack. We will go through those submissions, see the ones that seem like the sort of stuff that would be on the Gradient, like really good, thoughtful content that would be nice to amplify to the community. And then we will amplify it through the newsletter, and I guess probably also through our social channels, rather than posting it on the magazine, which I think serves the same basic purpose as the magazine did in the first place. And that's part of the reason we do want to keep it going, but just slightly less active than before on the magazine front.
And on the podcast front, where you're hearing this now, I will be continuing to do this as normal. As you've noticed, I've slowed down quite a bit recently, and this has just been because of things going on in my own life that have made it harder to do this every single week. The plan right now is to continue doing this roughly through the end of the year, a little bit into 2025 as normal. And you should all look forward to this. You'll be seeing my usual end of year episode with Nathan Benesh from Air Street Capital. We'll be going over the State of AI report and everything that happened this year in AI. And after that, a little bit, the plan is for me to transition that a bit away from the Gradient into something that is still has its roots in AI, but isn't going to be entirely AI focused. And if you've been following for a while, you've probably noticed some of these shifts already. I will be announcing more about what that looks like in the coming months.
And one last thing, I guess maybe many people don't know of this, but the Gradient does actually have a Mastodon server that has been around since, late 2022, I think. So it's been almost 2 years now since we started that thing. And there's still a fair number of active people on that Mastodon. Sigmoid Social is what we call it. And we will, keep that going. We are still moderating it, still kind of keeping an eye on it. There's a fair number of active people on there. So, as long as there is money to keep it alive, we will. No changes planned on that front. So I think that's pretty much all the announcements on the front of a gradient. Not too much is going to change. It's just kind of a structure of how this works and what you can expect from us is becoming a bit clearer. And we'll probably implement the changes of how you can pitch us your published blog and so on pretty soon. So you'll be seeing that go out.
And with that, we wanted to use the rest of this episode just to tell you a little bit more about what the gradient has been over time. A lot of you, as I said, have joined us pretty recently. And so you might not be familiar with the full history of what this thing is. As Andre and Hugh mentioned, they have both really been there from the beginning. I joined in around 2020 when we were just getting the newsletter and podcast started. And so it's been quite the time since then. A lot of interesting things have happened in the time that we've all been working on this. I guess, Hugh, do you want to go into a little bit more detail about how the gradient got started, where things went, what this all looked like?
Sure. I mean, at the gradient, at the beginning, it was just some sort of random chat. We just there were 5 undergrads and 1 grad student, Andre, and we just sort of discussed ideas, possibly at like a party or something. I don't know exactly how the idea evolved, but at some point we were like, we should start a blog. It seems like the kind of thing that you kind of come to at a late night while in college. We were like, we're going to start a blog.
We're going to start a blog. We're going to parties at Stanford, I guess.
We're gonna write the first few articles, some of ourselves. We're gonna go email people that we really like to just collect them, and then we got some really, really exciting blogs. I think one of the first blogs was Sebastian Reuter, who essentially predicted this entire LLM scaling pre-training style paradigm, and he called it the ImageNet moment for NLP is here. And it seems kind of dated in the sense that nowadays you don't compare things to ImageNet, you compare things to LLMs. But at the time, ImageNet was the thing that everybody compared to. And the thesis was something like you did a bunch of pre-training on ImageNet, and then when you fine-tuned on other image classification or other sort of image data sets, it would be much more effective than training from scratch on those data sets. And his claim was that something similar was going to happen / in the process of happening for NLP, where you would pre-train on some like large text corpus, such as the internet, and then you would fine tune on some other sort of like things that you cared about, and then things would do really well. And they had some preliminary results of that. Of course, things have clearly progressed tremendously since then, to the point where I think this is the dominant phenomenon, and people don't even think about training from scratch on the downstream tasks. They just obviously say you should train an LLM and then fine tune, and everybody's forgotten everything about it. That's how dominant this paradigm was. But back in 2018, it was really, really new and exciting. And then we had a bunch of other things. I think my favorite personal one was Horace He, who's now at PyTorch. He had a very spicy article, which essentially said PyTorch would outrun TensorFlow. And at the time, TensorFlow was completely dominant. PyTorch was sort of this new thing, which was up and coming, but wasn't anywhere close to the dominant framework that it was today. And basically he was like, yeah, PyTorch is going to beat TensorFlow. And I remember, because I was interning at Google at the time, people would just, people had long discussions about this article. It was just a huge thing, because this man who clearly knew what he was talking about, knew all the stats, knew all this stuff, was like, yes, PyTorch is coming. TensorFlow is, not going to be the dominant, framework. And people were just like, had lots and lots of opinions, just talked about this all the time. It lit a fire in the community. And, in many senses of the word, I think Horace was correct. In hindsight, it did seem like, at least in this period of time, PyTorch has become the dominant machine learning framework. And yeah, like this was, we just sort of evolved from there. We published more and more articles. We got more excited about other things, such as the podcast and the newsletter, which I think Andre and Daniel can tell you more about.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway from Hugh's history there is that everything important that has happened in AI in the past couple of years You heard it all here first.
I don't know if we'll go that far, but you could say we called LLMs maybe, or not us, but Sebastian Ruder. I do think that NLP article holds up. It was also still one of my favorites going back, and it was kind of an interesting example because I remember editing it, and I offered a lot of edits to Sebastian, so it was nice that he was kind of up for that process. So I guess I can go next since I'm kind of the second oldest gradient person. Hugh and his friends, I suppose, at the time were the real originators of it, and I sort of joined on pre-launch. So the way this happened is there was another one of the people involved, Nancy. I guess it seems like you were looking for people to actually write for the site, and I had already started doing some blog post writing, and I was involved in things like that at the time. So Nancy was just like, do you want to contribute something to this new thing? This was before it even launched. This was kind of in the planning phase. So I wrote some absurdly long post about reinforcement learning because I had a bunch of thoughts at the time. Probably still also holds up, you could argue. And then I had this 10,000 long article and was kind of impatient for the site to launch, and then just wound up sort of joining and trying to push it along and get it to go public and take off the ground. So after that, I sort of stuck around as a person involved in the editing process and the sort of running process of it. And then later, I forget, this was maybe 2021 or even 2022, I had by that point already started podcasting with Last Week in AI, which I still do. And one of the great things about working with the Gradient has been, obviously, we publish articles from outside our team. We, partner and help people to push their own stuff out. And so that's been one of the rewarding things, is getting to collaborate with a lot of really talented, interesting people from different backgrounds, release information on different topics like AI art, AI for medicine, all sorts of stuff, finance, etc. So that pretty much brought the idea of the Gradient podcast. Is at the time there were already AI podcasts out there, but none that were sort of going deep on topics in quite the same way as you could see on Gradient articles. And so I like this idea of, instead of doing sort of expansive interviews in the style of Lex Friedman or other podcasts out there, we could do something a little more focused and a little more technical, where we could get people from the AI community and really dive deep into their research, into their background, things like that. So I got that going at some point. I ran it for a few dozen episodes. Then life got in the way, and it made a lot of sense to hand it off to Daniel, who has, of course, been doing it since and has really made it his own kind of thing. So, yeah, it's been a ride, and I guess part of the reason that we do have to make the change is myself and Hugh, and to some extent Daniel, do just have less time to be doing it. Between doing a startup and a podcast, I have personally not been very involved over the last couple of years, just kind of jumping in here and there. So even though I do really feel very fond of the Gradient and wish I could commit more time to keep it as active as possible, it seems like a very practical thing to change things a little bit, but still keep it with like the central role being the like a place to amplify other people's voices and to help people read and learn about AI as it keeps moving faster and faster still.
A question for you, Andre. Among the few dozen interviews you did, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it's easy to say Yann LeCun was a highlight because that was just pretty exciting. And I think that one turned out pretty good. And then aside from kind of that obvious one, I guess one I think back on fondly is an interview with an AI artist, Helena Sauren, who goes back a long while. She was active in AI art before you had all these fancy text-to-image models, when GANs were the main game in town. And yeah, she's, I would say, one of the major AI artists and someone whose art I really do like a lot. So I found that to be really interesting, talking with much more of an artist who is still pretty technical and learning about that process. And aside from that, I mean, there are quite a few episodes with professors or researchers. And in those episodes, I got to kind of read through their research work, try and go through their almost career in a way, really going from early days to later on and seeing how that progressed. So I believe I talked with Chelsea Finn, probably Sergey Levine, or I don't know, a couple of people in robotics, and I was a grad student in robotics, so that was pretty fun. So yeah, it was, it's hard to highlight. I think there were quite a few that I liked a lot, but those are a couple that come to mind.
It's always hard to narrow down. Yeah. Since we were talking about earlier articles, another one I want to call out was I guess the title is #Bender Rule. Emily Bender wrote something for us at the end of 2019, and she references this 2011 paper she wrote about do's and don'ts for language independent NLP. The whole point was about the vast majority of NLP is done in basically two languages, and I think it was English and Spanish. And the Bender rule basically just says, do state the name of the language you're studying, even if that language is English. And the point is that acknowledging this foregrounds the possibility that techniques you're using might be language specific. Languages do work differently. They have different grammars. Things are going to work differently for them. So the idea that work that is done primarily in English is language independent is, according to Bender, just false. And I think that was like a pretty important, interesting early article. I'll also call out a recent one that I really liked. Well, there's so many. The one I thought Hugh was going to call out, which maybe I'll call out since he didn't, was this incredibly long, detailed article by Arjun Ramani and Zhengdong Wang. I see Hugh thinking that he probably should have called that one out, called Why Artificial Intelligence is Really, Really Hard to Achieve. That's with two reallys. That for emphasis there. And it's a pretty detailed argument collecting a lot of reasons, economic and from different areas, about why the idea that you're going to have super economically transformative artificial intelligence, the way that a lot of prognosticators might imagine, is actually a little bit harder than you might think. And I think they provide some great structure to how you should think through some of the economic impacts of AI. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, that article was great. Arjun and Zhendong are super insightful. Probably the best article that we've published in like recent years.
Way to make all our other authors feel bad, Hugh.
Well, I mean, we haven't published too many, so I guess that's not too hard to do. And I guess if we are calling out some more articles, and maybe we'll also highlight them in the Substack post, just to help people go back to some of the ones that are still probably worth reading to this day and are not kind of aged. One I really like is The Past, Present, and Future of AI Art by Fabian Offert. So this goes back to 2019 and, is, I think, still relevant. Like, AI art has changed in some sense. Now AI art usually refers to text to image, but I think the basic questions around it of, is it art? How is it different from human art, etc., are still pretty relevant and still largely maybe unresolved. So I quite like that one and think it's worth reading. And I'll call one extra one. We had a fair number of kind of overview articles that introduce you to a general topic, general area of research, or something along those lines. And one that I think is quite cool and maybe something many people are not as aware of is AI story generation. So Professor Mark Riedel published this piece, an introduction to AI story generation, that has a very nice, pretty in-depth overview of this area of research. And of course, now with LLMs, that's a whole thing, but there's, as with many things, a long history of people working on it. And it's definitely, if you're a nerd and like to learn about AI history, which I am to some extent, that's a really fun read.
I mean, if you're listening to this, you're probably a nerd. So, I predict a pretty high chance you'll like it. Before we begin closing out, do you two have anything else you want to talk about, tell the listeners?
Well, I guess it would be irresponsible of me not to plug my current, more active project. So actually, this is a funny point. So maybe it's worth also telling this little story. Somehow I wound up doing sort of 2 AI magazines in parallel for a while. So when I joined the Gradient team, I was already working. I hadn't even launched this yet, but I was already doing this thing called Skynet Today, which was started with the intent to kind of combat AI misinformation and AI hype at the time. So there was a lot of, even at that time, AI was already getting kind of big, and there was quite a lot of articles being posted, some of them being pretty inaccurate. So as a grad student at the time, I was like, well, this is kind of silly. Maybe we should start something where people who do work in AI can provide more context and a better explanation of certain news stories. Things like AlphaGo, and some people are saying AlphaGo means that we'll have AGI, which is pretty silly, especially now in hindsight. But also other things like OpenAI's Dota research, things like that. So anyway, I wound up doing that, and that also launched and was like a parallel project that had a pretty different focus. It was less for the AI community, but either way, I wound up publishing and editing on 2 fronts. And then that it also kind of morphed. So that magazine's Kind of Today is now sort of frozen. But what did come out of it is Last Week in AI, which is a newsletter where we have the news from the past week in AI, and also a podcast where we summarize every week's AI news. And not being just technical, we focus on kind of across the board tools and applications you can use. We cover business, we cover research, we cover policy. So we try to get it all. And that's why the episodes for that podcast tend to be like 2 hours long. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and plug that and say, if you aren't yet a listener or a subscriber to Last Week in AI, maybe you should check it out. You can go to lastweekin.ai for that Substack and find all the links and so on there.
Cool. Well, if we're going to do shameless plugging, first, also, I'll mention that the way I met Andre is during college, I started working on Skynet Today with him because I pitched an article on AI policy while I was taking like a US foreign policy class or something, and very excited about all of this, and continued writing articles and working on the newsletter and things like this. So that was really, I'm glad we did it. It was really fun. It was a great time. And I've guest hosted a couple of Last Week in AI episodes with Andre and can confirm it's a great overview if you're looking to keep up to date with things that are going on. And to close out this episode, I guess I'll finish with Hugh. You should have things to plug. You have some like cool stuff going on.
Some good research, cool papers.
Yeah. Tell us about your papers, Hugh.
I don't have too much to plug. I guess there's been some research that I've been excited about. We recently released GSM-1K, which was a replication of a common math data set called GSM-8K. And we basically did that to check how much data contamination was affecting the benchmarks. And the conclusion was actually that most of the frontier models actually showed no sign of data contamination. All the benchmark performance was like real. And there were a few cases where there was more data contamination than others, but like as a whole, like most models were actually quite good at generalizing to novel math data sets that they'd clearly never seen before because we just made it. More recently, I've been working on, I guess we recently released Plan Search, which was a sort of a method of doing inference time compute. Obviously, there's more popular methods of doing inference time compute now, most notably O1. But it's a very exciting direction with reasoning and inference time compute that I'm super excited about. And finally, something that's not out yet, but is publicly announced. We're making humanity's last exam, which is supposed to be our goal, the hardest, exam type question out there. And maybe even if we do it right, the last exam type eval out there, where there's like a single correct answer. All the other evals after that, if we do our job right, will sort of be interactive or other non-exam type evals. It's not the last evaluation, but maybe it's the last sort of quiz type evaluation. That's been publicly announced, but hasn't been completed yet. But hopefully will be completed in the coming short period. I don't want to make any promises, and then we'll have it out very soon. But yeah, other than that, I think I just wanted to thank all the listeners and readers of The Gradient. It's been really an honor to sort of have you folks for the last 6 years, and we really appreciate it as Gradient editors.
Yeah. Also, if all of that overview excited you and you at some point in the future want to hear an extended Hugh Zhang interview, let me know and we'll try to make this happen. And
real quick, actually, before we close out, since we are talking so much about The Gradient, probably worth calling out to the other people currently involved. We've had many people involved over the years, many editors, and all of us have done this as a side project. We do make some money for Substack, but we're very terrible about paying ourselves. So this is really a passion project for everyone involved, with most people having full-time jobs and so on. So it's been really great to have everyone who has worked and contributed. And currently there is still a number of people who actively work on the newsletter and really make that very, I guess, successful, consistent project, unlike the magazine. So Daniel, you're the most involved with him right now. Maybe you can give him a shout out.
Yeah, let me call you out all by name. Cole Frank, Jamie Shung, Shruk Gupta, and Justin Lande. I've been working with the four of you for a while now for various slants. Justin and Shrut have been with us for quite a while, especially Justin. He's been there for years. And you all have just been so wonderful to work with, so thoughtful. You have very different writing styles, different interests, and it's really wonderful to get to put that together in the newsletter we pull out. So, I want to thank you all for doing that. It's great to have you all. And with that, I think I should also probably mention that we've had a number of editors who have been with us and since left. And I don't know if any of you are listening, but if you are, I'm also very, very thankful to have worked with you. I think that we've all learned a lot from each other. So I'll stop being sentimental and begin closing out. For some finishing plugs, if you want to follow us in various ways, we'll drop links in the Substack post that this comes out with. I have other places where I write, so if you're interested in hearing weird thoughts, that's another place where you can hear more from me. And if you are listening to this, you should subscribe to the podcast RSS. Get in touch if you want to help us out in some fashion. While we are slowing things down a bit, there is still a potential future world where we have more editors with more time and we're able to invest more into that. That just doesn't happen to be this moment in time, but we do want to keep this effort going. So if you want to help that out in any way, we'd love to hear from you. That's the editor at, not the editor, that is editor at thegradient.pub.
I think we have contact. We should really start using a contact email at some point. But yes, anyway, and yeah, to make a fine point of it, if you are currently listening on the web version of Substack to this, then there might be a feature. In fact, it is somewhat likely that this podcast will move off of the Substack. So you would want to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or I don't know, whatever app you use for podcasts to make sure you don't lose track of it. And one last sentimental note, since I don't think we've done it. If there are any contributors to The Gradient from outside, any people who have written with The Gradient or even just pitched articles to us and somehow we failed to follow up, we do also, of course, appreciate that. It's been really fantastic to have a fair number of articles, a fair number of people contribute, and hopefully we have provided some beneficial editing and I guess signal boosting to your work. Obviously, at the end of the day, the reason the gradient even became a thing that stuck around is that people did submit some really cool stuff, and we just got to help people share their thoughts and their work. So it's been great.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to close. We love and appreciate all of you. Thank you for listening.